Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get going and people may continue to filter in. My name is Katie Naples Mitchell. I'm the program director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management here at the Harvard Kennedy School's Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. I am delighted that you all have joined us today. I want to open with a brief announcement, which is that unfortunately one of our guests for today, Tamar Manassa, cannot join us due to a death in the family, and we extend our sincerest condolences to her, and hopefully we will be able to find a time to bring her back at a different moment to join us and to expand this conversation over time. We are recording today's event, so please be aware that anything you say will be publicly recorded. This is an open meeting rather than a webinar, so we encourage people to share insights and resources and reflections and questions in the chat as they come to you. We also will always make sure that if you have questions, we create room at the end for everyone to ask those questions and to ask them yourself. So you're welcome to put them in the chat as they come to you, and then we'll circle back to make sure that we go back to that stack that's listed in the chat. I am delighted that Alex Vitale is joining us today. Alex is coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. And he is the author of both City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and The End of Policing. He's a frequent essayist whose writings have been published in a whole range of publications of prominence, and a frequent commentator, and we are really excited to talk about what it means to think about policing in terms of its historical and social context, and what kinds of solutions we can center in thinking about how to reduce the size, scope, and power of the police. So Alex is going to open with some remarks, and then we'll move into a moderated conversation. And Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Katie, and hello to everybody. I see some familiar faces as I scrolled through the portraits of everybody on the call, and looking forward to today's conversation. I'm sorry that Tamar wasn't able to join us. I think some of us probably heard her on NPR this week talking about the high holidays and the innovative things she's doing in the South Side of Chicago. And so I look forward to trying to listen in the future when you're able to reschedule her. Okay, so where are we? Look, in the wake of the killing of Mike Brown and the Ferguson uprising, we were told that policing was gonna get fixed. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing with lots of leading lights, researchers, etc., who laid out this exhaustive program of police reform. And many departments embraced a lot of ideas on that list. And the Department of Justice under Obama and again under Biden has entered into a number of consent decrees requiring many of these reforms, and it just hasn't produced the desired results. The officers involved in the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020 had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras. We're operating under a new, more restrictive use of force policy. We're operating on a bystander policy that requires officers to intervene when they see misconduct by another officer. They were operating under a new accountability system that included an early warning system to identify potential high-risk officers. And none of it made any difference. None of it made any difference. Where are these model police departments that have been reformed? Yes, we have these consent decrees. Yes, we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on police reform. And yes, a lot of boxes have been ticked about new language, new training, new procedures, new equipment. But police are still killing 3 people a day. In fact, the number of police killings is going up and has been going up the last couple of years. Where is the evidence that this works? Now, we've had a couple of studies here or there that purport to show some incremental marginal improvement in one measure or another. But when we look at the dynamics holistically, We just don't see the evidence of success. Why is this? Well, I think it's because these reforms fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the problem. They assume that the police exist to be the neutral enforcers of the rule of law, and that this neutral enforcement will automatically benefit everyone. That the law is this public good, the rule of law is what sets us free, and the police create this level playing field that allows this to happen. But this is largely fanciful. The law is not some kind of neutral playing field that benefits everyone equally. There's a famous 19th century saying, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets." Problems that we very much have today. And of course, the rich aren't concerned about these laws. These laws were designed to protect a deeply unequal system of property relations. An even more egregious example would be the war on drugs. This idea that if we could just get the police to enforce the war on drugs in a more professional and unbiased manner, that this would produce some public good. But in fact, the whole legal framework of the war on drugs is fundamentally unjust. It's a politically motivated racial project. And the solution to that is not to give narcotics units anti-bias training or more oversight. The only reasonable solution to that is to eliminate the war on drugs. We've had this war on drugs in its modern form for over 50 years. No lives have been saved. No one's been prevented from getting drugs. Overdoses are through the roof. By any reasonable measure of effectiveness, it's a 100% failure. We've thrown literally millions of human beings into cages for no measurable public safety or public health benefit, because that wasn't the point. The Nixon administration began the modern war on drugs to solve a set of political problems, to try to win over historically Democratic voters in the South and to some extent in the suburbs in the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement. And he knew that he couldn't return to formal segregation. So they gin up this war on drugs and war on crime to signal to these white voters that the Republican Party is going to be the home of racial animus, the mobilization of a racial project for political purposes, the demonization of entire communities to serve a set of political goals, not public safety and public health goals. And so we need a framework that understands that the law is not automatically beneficial to everyone, is not automatically a just endeavor. And getting the police to more professionally enforce those laws is not necessarily improving substantive justice. And that's one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Obama report and most of the police reforms that we see under consideration, like all the elements of the Justice for George Floyd Act before Congress, is that it's rooted in a procedural justice analysis that just imagines that if we further professionalize policing, this will restore public trust in the police so that the police can go about waging a war on drugs, a war on gangs, a war on terror, a war on immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, without any consideration of whether or not those wars are in fact in any way just. And of course, resistance to policing stems in large part precisely because of the unjustness, the injustice of these interventions. So it also this police reform framework not only misunderstands the nature of the legal frameworks that police enforce, it misunderstands the nature of the police institution itself. And I have to say, so many of these police reformers, I just don't think they actually know very much about what police do. It's just incredibly naive. I've spent 30 years riding around in the back of police cars, walking around, watching police do what they do. And this idea that they're out neutrally enforcing the law for the benefit of everyone just has very little to do with the reality of everyday policing. What police are doing is micromanaging the lives of the most vulnerable, the most left out, the most disadvantaged, in ways that produce a version of social order that benefits some at the expense of others. So that when we need an analysis of the police institution and its historical function, what differentiates policing from other kinds of governmental interventions is the authorization and capacity to use violence. The authorization and capacity to use violence. Police are violence workers. They also have the authorization and capacity to break other kinds of laws, like spying on people and searching their homes. And that this violence is mobilized in the service of producing a particular notion of social order. If we look at the early origins of policing around 200 years ago and less, we see consistently the production of modern policing in relationship to crises that result from one or more of three primary systems of economic exploitation. So policing emerges to manage the consequences of systems of exploitation. What are these three interwoven systems of exploitation? Colonialism, slavery, and industrialization. These are all systems of exploitation. And when the folks who are being exploited, whether it's wage workers who are not sharing in the profits that they're generating and whose lives are being immiserated, whether it's the subjects of colonial exploitation, violence, and degradation who resist, or enslaved people who resist their enslavement, policing emerges to manage those acts of resistance, to create a social order that benefits those who are on the winning end of those systems of exploitation. Now, we don't have, slavery and colonialism in that 19th century sense in the United States. We barely have industrialization in many parts of the country anymore. Instead, what we have is a system of neoliberal austerity in which wealth is being pushed up the economic ladder in the service of global competitiveness, so that cities, states, and the federal government are tripping over each other, trying to offer subsidies to the already most successful economic sectors in hopes that they will become so successful on the global stage that some of their wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of us. But of course, that's not what's happened. What's happened has been a massive redistribution of wealth up the economic ladder, the creation of a class of billionaires with no trickle down, the creation of a massive segment of the population that is under or unemployed, has a variety of social and personal problems that do not receive adequate care, a shrinking middle class, a growing sense of economic precarity that then feeds into right-wing movements to create some sort of false sense of security in the face of these profound economic changes that are underway. And if we look at what police actually do day in and day out, they're managing the lives of those on the losing end of those arrangements. They're breaking up homeless encampments. They're chasing unemployed kids off street corners. They're responding to untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. They're attempting to control black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods that have become the main source of economic life for large segments of society. They're not finding bank robbers and serial killers. And they're not protecting people effectively from serious violent crime. We now know that the vast majority of violent crime is never even reported to the police. And of that is reported to the police, the vast majority is not solved. Much of it is not even investigated in any real sense. Estimates are, I think, from the Vera Institute that about 2% of all serious crime results in some kind of a conviction. And then it's not even clear that those convictions really make us any safer. So we operate under this myth of police effectiveness. People watch too much television. They think the police are out getting these super bad guys, but in fact, they're criminalizing the poor. Now, the solution to this is not just to demonize the police as, out of control authoritarians and all that kind of stuff. I work with police all over the world. It's much more complicated than that. The bigger issue here is, why has our political system, both parties, come to view the police as the appropriate tool to address every social problem under the sun? Well, in part because they're committed to this politics of austerity. They believe they have no alternative but to turn over the resources of society to the already most wealthy actors in hopes that that their city doesn't become Detroit in the 1990s, abandoned, falling apart, etc. And so they resist any effort to try to directly address these social problems through some combination of state and community-based interventions, and just turn the problem over to the police to try to put a lid on it. So 2020 comes, this understanding that police reform doesn't work goes mainstream in many regards, and cities begin to make some changes. Now, very few of them have reduced police spending, and there's been a huge political backlash to that, as everyone is aware of. But what has happened, is that huge numbers of cities are beginning to build out public safety infrastructures that replace the functionality of police in important ways. So we've seen dozens of cities create new school disciplinary systems, bring back counselors, after-school programs, support services, and in many cases, they have eliminated their school police departments. We've seen about 100 cities create non-police mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, interrelated, crisis response teams. The ones that are furthest along, like Denver STAR program, are just showing tremendously positive results. They're diverting huge numbers of 911 calls. They're reducing jail admissions, hospital admissions, and recent research shows that in the neighborhoods that they currently operate in, crime rates are going down relative to those neighborhoods that they don't operate in. So it's producing tremendous spillover public good for these cities. And I think this is a trend that's going to continue. Polling data consistently shows that the American public, regardless of political party, feel that police should not be in charge of the nation's mental health, which they currently, in essence, are, and jails as well. We've also seen dozens of cities building out community-based violence intervention programs. Some of these are extremely exciting. Some are very thin and need a lot of work, But the most developed of them, such as what's going on in Newark, where I was earlier today, are very exciting, where they're taking a holistic approach to violence reduction. Violence is at a 60-year low in Newark, really bucking trends that we see in other parts of the country. And I think maybe we'll have some time to talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. So these movements to pressure cities to rethink how they produce public safety are, on track. Campaigns are starting constantly. I'm working in a number of cities across the country on a regular basis and speaking intermittently with folks in dozens of other cities. So I see these campaigns underway. I see the progress that they're making. And this is a movement that is very much alive and well. So I'll stop there, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation.
Thank you for that, Alex. That's a really useful overview to bring us kind of up to speed in the present. And I think also to lay out some of the kind of socio-political historical context. I was trying to also, in the chat as you were speaking, I hope it wasn't too distracting, add in some of the empirical support for some of the ideas that you were conveying as well in social science research. And I want to kind of pivot for a second and just get a little bit more theoretical, as you ended in a place that was so concrete. And then we'll get back to some of the kind of concrete examples in the field. But, your book centrally is about the idea that policing has ballooned to cover a whole range of social ills, which is an idea that isn't necessarily inherently an abolitionist idea. But part of our focus today is to take seriously, what does it mean to think about police abolition? What does that look like? So I want to start with that question. What would police abolition look like to you? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. So somewhere there's a giant switch, and if we could just find it, all police would just disappear tomorrow. And that's what police abolition. No, that's not what we're talking about, right? There is no such magical switch. Nobody in this movement has the ability to just make the police disappear. So this has been a kind of false framing of the issue that's been used to try to say, oh, well, they don't have a plan for what they're going to do for every possible scenario when all police are gone tomorrow. There is no scenario where all police are gone tomorrow. What we have is a massive system of policing, and we need to begin a process of unwinding that. And even if we wanted a wholesale elimination of policing, there's just no path to doing that. And that's not really what people are talking about. What we're talking about is creating new infrastructures that allow us to dial back our reliance on policing in as many ways as we possibly can. And, part of that is an understanding that policing doesn't do what people think it does, that it's not effective in the ways people think it is, that it's extremely a costly intervention, in not just in financial terms, but ideologically in terms of the harms they cause. Police are responsible for about 5% of all homicides in the United States. And they mobilize a tremendous amount of gun violence in our society. And not to mention the injuries, the degradation. The Vera Institute produced a study last year that gathered together the growing body of evidence about the harms of intensive policing for the communities that are subjected to it. Reduced educational outcomes, mental health and physical health deficits, reduced civic participation, etc. So policing comes with tremendous costs, and we have these alternatives. So first of all, it's a process. Second, so abolition is a process. It's not a preordained outcome. And second, it's an analysis that says that policing is an inherently problematic social intervention, policy intervention, and we should try to get police out of the scenario in as many ways as we possibly can, based on a lot of the ideas that I discussed earlier, that this is not the tool we should be using. And the third part is, yes, it's a vision driven by a set of principles, that we should try to solve our problems through care, compassion, solidarity, treating people with as much dignity as possible, while policing and the rest of the criminal legal system relies on principles of fear, control, coercion, violence, degradation, humiliation. And so why wouldn't we want to try to avoid a system that relies on those principles in as many ways as we possibly can? And as we get police out of traffic enforcement, get them out of the schools, get them out of mental health, get them out of drugs, then we can reassess with what's left. Oh, turns out we don't need them to deal with gangs and youth violence either. We don't need them to deal with sex work. We don't need them to do these other things. We need to build up these other structures. And what we find is that that's the vast majority of what police do every day. There's not a lot left after we deal with those things.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer. And I think giving people a language and the patience to think about abolition as a process, as opposed to, and as a praxis, as opposed to as kind of an abstraction or as a utopia, I think is really helpful to try to ground us in the present. And one of the things you just mentioned as an area where maybe the police are not the only or not even the most effective interventions is around gangs. And I think that might be novel for some people listening. I think so often we have, thought of, reformers often think about policing of gangs as something that they don't want to disturb. And so I thought, given your work at Brooklyn College on this issue and also the work you're doing in Newark now, we've seen in Chicago just recently that the gang database is officially being erased again, right? That the mayor's office is moving away from that kind of police regime and police enforcement. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, the ways in which gang policing has this widely documented entrenched racial targeting and has swept people into surveillance and criminalization in the most extreme cases, federal conspiracy convictions for potentially unrelated, already prosecuted offenses in state courts. So how are directly impacted people and organizers and researchers working around thinking about policing in the context of even those most serious offenses and trying to find different kinds of interventions?
Yeah, so it's a really important topic, and it brings together a number of different threads. So first of all, is it useful to even talk about this as a quote unquote gang issue? Even the police can't tell you what a gang is. They routinely conflate, 5 guys who have an organized drug operation and sometimes use violence to collect debts and resolve business disputes with 5 kids who walk to school together, play basketball, like to wear the same designer clothes. That those are all just gangs in the minds of the police, including groupings of young people who've never considered themselves to be a gang. They just live in the same area, have friends, commemorate a friend who was lost to violence sometimes, right? But then the police would give them a gang name and then put them in the gang database because the police have a framing of these problems that guides how they see the world, right? They think that basically the world's divided up into good people and bad people. This is this kind of thin blue line mentality. And that the way we deal with bad people is threats, coercion, intimidation, violence, humiliation, to force them to either change their ways or be pushed out of society and into the criminal legal system. It's been a completely failed strategy by any reasonable measure you can come up with. Just doesn't work. There's no evidence behind it. And in many ways, it makes a problem worse. It hardens oppositional identities. It drives people into facilities where they're further traumatized and further come to rely on groupings and associations that use violence to try to protect themselves and wield power, and then that spills back into the community so that disputes on the inside become disputes on the outside and vice versa. So the people who call themselves gang experts, to me, that already raises suspicion. You've already framed the issue in a problematic way. None of this is to say we don't have violence problems, or that we have young people who band together and do things in various ways, crews, sets, cliques, whatever. But to call them gangs is often a step in the wrong direction. Okay, so what do we do instead? How do we do? Okay, so harms are being committed. We need strategies that are going to get to the root of the problem. What's producing this harmful behavior that we want to address? And this requires community-based strategies. That's just the reality of it, that police-centered strategies are not working. So what we need to do is look at both sort of micro level dynamics and macro level dynamics. At the micro level, we need to understand that almost all young people involved in violence have previously been the victims of violence or some other kind of extreme trauma at home, in the community, at school, wherever, that has been largely unaddressed. They are angry, they are scared, they are easily driven to passionate responses to things, and this can lead to further violence. When we look closely at most community violence, it is not related to organized activity. It is about interpersonal beefs. You did this to my cousin, now we're going to go get you, and you said something to, to my girlfriend, or it's an extension of like domestic beefs of various kinds. And so we need to be able to reach into those dynamics. And that's what a growing number of places are doing. Credible messengers, cure violence, advance peace, high-risk interventionists, different terms, slightly different models, at least on paper. But in the 10 years that I've spent looking at what people actually do under these different models, the actual practices out on the street all pretty much look the same. They're intervening as early as possible when there's either a flag is raised about the possibility of violence, or there's been violence and we want to prevent the violence from spreading, from cascading into retributive violence. And this early intervention involves communicating with people, trying to reach people emotionally. Okay, what's going to be gained by escalating this situation? Rumor control. This is not what you think it is. The person that you're sure did this, it turns out they were out of town. That they're not the person who did it. Let's cool off, figure out what really happened. Mediation. Okay, you're upset. You've got a legitimate reason for being upset. Let's see if we can figure out something where everyone saves face, more or less, and we resolve the problem. Maybe, we need to get that person out of the environment. In Newark, they're using the Victims Compensation Fund, again, because all these kids have been victimized by violence, to relocate someone who is the object of community ire because of their past behavior. And this allows people to return to normal without needing to enact violence and kill someone. Or maybe there needs to be some kind of restitution, for an act of violence. Or maybe in the worst case scenario, maybe an organized fistfight needs to be arranged that allows people to restore a sense of street honor through a process that is intelligible to all those involved and prevents an escalation from occurring. Or maybe we need to arrange for someone who's the object of ire to be escorted around for a while, and also to be given some assistance to finish school, and maybe to be put on track for an apprenticeship, for a job, in ways that just change the dynamics in the neighborhood around that person. So that's a lot of the work I'm doing right now in Newark, is trying to unpack these stories and look at the actual mechanisms of causation that are being operationalized by these what are called high-risk interventionists in Newark, that have allowed violent crime in Newark to be at this 60-year low. I mean, it's a remarkable story about just how low they've driven the violence rates. Just, huge drop off in so many categories, and most importantly in homicides. And I'll just say this, we've gotten this message from supporters of, police-centered violence reduction, the kind of focused deterrence model from David Kennedy, or the let's throw everything at the problem from folks like Thomas Abt, who say, well, everyone has this really important role to play in solving the problem. We need the police to send a tough message, and DAs to get rid of the worst offenders, and the community to kind of help pick up the pieces. But that's not how this works. What I've seen time and time again in city after city is that the more we take police out of the equation and turn the problem over to the community, the better it works. That to the extent that the police are involved, the community will not trust what's happening, will resist it, and the results will not be very positive for very long. There may be short-term, improvements in one category to another. They don't tend to be long-lasting, and the level of the effect is quite small, and much smaller than what we're seeing in Newark. And then I'm sorry, and then we need
no, please keep going.
Ultimately, we need macro level interventions, right? This is happening almost entirely in the poorest, most disadvantaged communities in our society, where there's entrenched racialized poverty. And we can it's been amazing how much we can improve the situation through micro level interventions. But if we don't do something about that entrenched poverty, we are going to be facing the continual cycle of the next generation of young people, being a source of problems. And so we've got to have some kind of real conversation about addressing poverty, which is just not on the political agenda at all.
It's such a key point that there has to be interventions working at both the structural and systemic and at the individual interpersonal, right? And that both of those have a compounding effect. I think that's really a useful takeaway. And I know there have been some, I'm just going to mention offhand a couple of studies that have been done that are not effectively focused at that structural level, but that are still looking at how space shapes people's environment and how that creates the circumstances that inspire or prevent violence, right? And so one of the things that Tamar, who couldn't join us today, has done is that kind of work, right? Taking up space in one's community, retaking ownership of space in community, building community through that work. And I think there are some related studies about cleaning and greening neighborhoods through randomized control trials that have an excellent evidence base. I mean, there's study after study that's been published by folks like Dr. Eugenia South at Penn and Dr. Charles Brannis at Columbia, who's the chair of epidemiology there, in this kind of public health literature that I think there isn't enough, conversation between people that are working in kind of criminal legal policy and public health sometimes. And so part of the work, as I see it in people who think about abolition, is bringing those threads together, right, and trying to look holistically at solutions across the board from multiple disciplines.
Yeah, and I just give a shout out to We Build the Block here in Brooklyn, that's trying to bring together both those kind of greenings, holding space, and also doing the more intensive intervention. So they're bringing in credible messengers, they're doing trauma counseling, they're engaging young people in a systematic way. They're not just out on a street corner telling everyone, hey, chill out. It's, no, they're involved in very conscious, intensive, holistic approaches.
So I certainly have more questions for you, Alex, but we've already got some wonderful ones in the chat and one that was sent to me directly by somebody who is not in a position to ask it based on where they are. But I think let's start with some of those questions, and then if the conversation dies down, we can always pivot back to the questions I prepared. So Terrence Gilchrist, you had the first question in the chat. Would you like to ask your question? Terrence, are you with us? And if not, I can ask it for you if you're not in a...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
My apologies to everyone.
No worries.
So I was involved in this work like 13 or 15 years ago. It happened to be in Newark. And I've heard so many examples about doing an alternative approach to policing. I find it great, but I also find it very frustrating that, 15 years later, after the kind of work that I did, there's still these conversations. So if you were to talk to someone like the mayor of Baltimore, who's asking for people to be locked up, not that he intended to do that when he became mayor, but when you talk to these elected officials who become really frustrated and they're feeling pressure from police unions, how do you change the narrative? Like, what really moves the needle on this conversation? Because there's so many excellent examples, and I put one in the chat, as maybe you saw, about what Mayor R.T. Rybach did in Minneapolis with the city council and other people. They had 0 homicides of Minneapolis residents in 2008. Now, 6 people from St. Paul were shot, but they still achieved something incredible. But it's, that was 2008. It's 2023, almost 2024. How do we really move the needle on this conversation with all the excellent examples that we have?
Yeah, I wish there were a simple answer to that. I was out in Minneapolis during that period and sat in on the community planning meetings and worked with Sasha Cotton, who was heading the blueprint implementation for the health department, because they put the violence reduction efforts in the health department, which is a great place for it. Unfortunately, here in New York, it's in the mayor's office of criminal justice, which all automatically poisons some of the community perceptions about what's happening. Okay, I mean, I don't have a recipe for solving the problems in Baltimore, a city I know fairly well. My wife lived there a number of years, and I'm there fairly frequently. The mayor, he talked a good talk about violence reduction, but I think he was invested in this throw everything at the problem model, which is in a way working at cross purposes. I'm not sure why they've not been willing to build out a more holistic approach. What they have is they do have a few isolated programs, some things at the hospital, a couple of community-based violence intervention groups, but they don't have the whole package of trauma counseling referrals, intensive engagement with youth at high risk, and comprehensive street outreach, early warning systems, community trainings, all the stuff that actually is going on in Newark. The messaging, I mean, we're having to overcome a huge inertia, right? Where communities have been told for generations under austerity politics that they can have police or they can have nothing. And so when confronted by very real problems like high levels of violence, many people, though not all, will say, well, at least give us police. And of course, the police want that, and the better off, more conservative communities want that. And so it's hard for, a handful of reformers within high violence communities to single-handedly change the politics of the city. And I just think,
I would say this really quick.
Road.
Yeah, I would say this really quick. Like, in talking with detectives from Minneapolis who worked on the youth violence reduction, they would say put the best people in this. So they had the best detectives work on it. Not saying use all detectives for this, but put the best detectives, best social workers, best educators, put the best people to work on these issues for those particular populations. That was some feedback I received from Minneapolis.
Well, I think what we need is more proof of concept. And that's what's driven me to go out to Newark. They reached out to me and asked me to come see what they were doing. I think it looks much better than what I have seen people saying about it. And I think we need more storytelling about what this is, how it works, and why it's preferable. So that's what I'm trying to do right now is to try to write up about what's happening there for a general audience, to tell these stories. And that's my hope. As more of these programs come online, we need more of that kind of storytelling, that there is something other than police or nothing that we can offer people.
Thank you both for that really rich discussion. We have a number of other questions in the chat, so I'm going to move straight along. I know Sandra had a question to ask next up in the queue. So Sandra, go ahead and unmute.
I'm actually happy to have other folks go first, and I will jump in line if we.
She's asked me a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I just wanted to honor the queue as it forms, but that's great. So then we've got Claire Barker. Claire, do you want to ask your question about Boston's gang database?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Professor Vitale, for being here. My church group is reading your book, and we're finding it very interesting. So my question is, here in Boston, Mayor Wu campaigned against funding BRIC and has changed her mind based on reforms with the peace officer standards and training thing at the state level, and also the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, and the removal of a lot of names from the gang database, saying that the problem with BRIC has been solved. And now I think the proposal is for $3.4 million over a number of years. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the effectiveness of these kinds of intelligence systems and sharing, especially with ICE. And then for those of us in Boston, is there information we can use on that pushes back against the narrative that BRIC is going to be useful?
Yeah, so I actually had a meeting with folks in the mayor's office in Boston just last week to talk about some planning that's underway there and research that's underway. So I think, like a lot of these mayors, they're politically in a difficult situation, and so they're at times doing contradictory things. So on the one hand, there's this momentum behind predictive policing and trying to be smart about policing. And the other hand, there's also a lot of momentum for non-police strategies. And so what they've been doing in Boston, which is a model that I've been proposing broadly, right, is they're doing a broad community assessment, especially in the highest crime communities. They're doing town halls, they're doing focus groups, they're doing survey research about what the kind of public safety challenges are that people see, what people would like to see done to address these challenges. And then what they're going to do is start to roll out some programmatic interventions. So I think it's hard to say be patient, but my sense is that the folks who are thinking about public safety policy are trying to move in the right direction to the extent that there is political space to do so. And so anything that folks can do to signal support for these kinds of community-based strategies, I think that now is the time to signal that, to make the ask. Why can't we have these things that we know will make us safer, rather than putting more resources into predictive policing models that have not shown any meaningful success except at more racial profiling and mass criminalization.
I would just offer one other thing, Claire, if you're not already aware, you may already be aware, but that the Muslim Justice League has put out a call of ways that people can get involved in responding at City Council in Boston. So you might follow their resources. I think they may have testimony templates or other things, and people are organizing against that.
Great. Can you put that in the chat, please?
I certainly will.
Thanks,
I promise.
Katie.
Yep, no problem. So our next question was through a private message to me from somebody who's not available to in a place to be able to make that comment right now, but offered. This is from Ni Win, and Ni wrote, "I'm also curious about how we can respond to different incidents, such as the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021, where several Asian women were killed. When really violent harm occurs, what should the next step look like? What does accountability look like outside of the criminal legal system in that context? That's something we're wrestling with, and we don't quite have the language for how best to define accountability."
Okay, so there are two issues here. Is first of all, we want to be in prevention mode. And then the second issue is, but bad things are going to happen no matter how much prevention we have. So how do we respond to them? But the most important, most effective thing we can do is to get into prevention mode. Now, there are two kind of frameworks for thinking about prevention for these kinds of mass shootings, misogynistic, bias shootings, domestic dispute, spree killings. You know, these things are interwoven in complex ways. They revolve around a lot of toxic masculinity, homophobia, xenophobia, and all the rest. So the two frameworks, one is a kind of interdiction prevention framework, and the other is a more demand side prevention framework. So the interdiction framework focuses on things like gun control, these kind of early warning systems where we take the guns away from people or we put them under surveillance. The demand side tries to look at, well, what is driving all of these toxic viewpoints? We can talk about it as a mental health issue in some ways. If we think about mental health broadly as interwoven with socio-political dynamics as well, right? We have huge levels of untreated mental health distress in our society that we wait until it becomes a horrible crisis, and then something goes wrong, and then the police get called and they don't know what to do because they're not equipped to, so they shoot the person, force them to a hospital, arrest them, or do nothing. Right? It's not a very satisfying response. So what are we doing to move further upstream? Right? Why is it that we don't have hardly any real engagement with the problems of toxic masculinity? So I mentioned We Build the Block earlier here in Brooklyn. There was recently an article in The Trace, which is an outlet to specifically talk about gun violence issues, that talked about the way they're dealing with domestic violence as an issue about male privilege and toxic masculinity. Not by going around and wagging their finger at men, but by drawing people into conversations, getting at the root of the trauma and insecurities that drive a lot of those toxic viewpoints, right? So that when we improve people's economic security, when we provide them with some level of stable mental health supports, we won't have so many of these shootings. Now, I'm all for, gun control and all of that. I don't see it happening very soon. And I also don't think it will just solve the problem, because we see in Europe, fortunately, we don't see the mass shootings in the same way, but we do see stabbings, we do see domestic violence, we do see these problems because they're not dealing enough with the demand side. So I'm not opposed to gun control, but I think we need to shift our focus to these demand side prevention strategies.
Thanks for that, Alex.
And then I'm sorry, and then I didn't say, but if something terrible happens, what do we do? Well, first of all, we have to engage the survivors and the victims and their immediate needs in ways that the criminal justice system is typically not interested in. They're just interested in retribution, right? And so when we engage people and talk about what do you need to be stabilized, to help repair these harms, out of that, we can talk about, well, what would you like to see happen? And then we need to let them play a role in that decision-making, but not in the way that the criminal justice system does it, which is it just takes over for them and tells them what they're going to get. We find time after time the ways in which the criminal legal system is not acting in the interests or at the behest of the victims. The victims do not want the criminal legal interventions that are being proposed. They don't want the death penalty. They don't want the criminalization of their partner, for instance. They want help to prevent this from happening. They want to see engagement with prevention strategies. That time and time again, that's what survivors tell us, is that what they want is for this not to happen to anyone else. And throwing the perpetrator, who often is already dead, into prison, it's like threatening the death penalty to suicide bombers. It's ridiculous, right? So, and also I think some truth telling is what people want. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Who missed the early warning signs? Because there are almost always early warning signs that have not been adequately addressed.
Looks like we just both Leah Sakala and I just tweeted this or added the same resource to the chat.
Same
so that
resource,
knows,
right.
you're on the right page when you all have access to that those same resources. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Maritza Soto, I think, is next in the queue, although the questions come slightly later. So Maritza, go ahead and ask your questions.
Hi, thank you so much, Alex. I had a question about your opinion on the effectiveness of police review and advisory boards, and what your thoughts are about democratically elected police review and advisory boards. Is a democratically elected police review and advisory board better than a regular one? What are the benefits, or are there any benefits?
The simple answer is no benefits. I mean, I was talking to George Gascon, the DA of Los Angeles, about this, and he's like, I got a whole shelf in my office of studies of review boards, and they all say the same thing. Makes no difference. Those review boards are about legitimacy seeking and demobilizing anger and protest in the community. They take righteous indignation and anger and they channel it into a pointless bureaucratic process that doesn't change anything. Even when on rare occasion an individual officer is disciplined, or even in the more rare case where some policy gets changed, we don't see it produce any meaningful change in the way policing is conducted, because the marching orders and mission haven't changed. The politicians are still telling them to clear those corners, get those homeless encampments out of public sight, get those kids, into prison who are disrupting classes, and until that changes, we can't expect these oversight and disciplinary systems to make a tremendous amount of difference. I mean, we think, well, this will allow us to weed out the worst offenders, but the vast majority of harms of policing are done according to procedure. Millions of people's lives have been ruined around the war on drugs and the war on the poor in ways that don't involve extreme violence and are according to policy. And that's really the issue we have to get at here. I know it seems, again, it's rooted in this misunderstanding about the idea of police and the rule of law. I just think that the police are doing exactly what they've been told to do. There's no mistake here.
I think for a different vision of kind of community control of police, right? There are scholars that we had one on last semester who I just want to mention, that there are other visions of kind of community control of public safety, let's say, that is very different than a police review board that even those that have some kind of subpoena power ultimately do not result directly in hiring or firing officers or doing any kind of direct policy enforcement. But there have been models in the past and in the present of kind of community control of public safety that I think are very different and can be much more effective. And in some ways that leads into the other research we were talking about and the other kinds of organizing that we were talking about, of people kind of taking up space in their own communities, taking accountability for their own community's safety and for knowing their neighbors and for interceding in violence, right? That those are other ways to think about what does community control really mean, and how can you democratize systems and structures. Just want to offer that.
I think there's also there's a lot of cities that are undertaking some kind of reimagining public safety process. They've created little committees or commissions that involve, have civilian members on them. And some of these have proven to be very generative of creating really holistic plans about how to make communities safer, without worrying about whether or not it's police. Just let's look at the evidence. When Ithaca, New York did this around drugs, they came up with the Ithaca plan. It was tremendous. Harm reduction strategies, drug treatment on demand, targeted economic development initiatives, et cetera. And nothing was pre-decided. They brought in some experts. They did town halls, focus groups. And in the end, nobody found anything for the police to do. Whatever it was they thought police could do, there was like someone else who actually would do that better with fewer harms and collateral consequences and at lower cost. So let's have demands for civilian controlled reimagining public safety committees that come out with plans for, like, how do we actually make our community safer? What do we need to do that? And some resources to bring in experts to help advise them, to look at models from other cities, et cetera.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this, both of you.
Our pleasure. So next up, we've got a question from Jen Bookwald. Jen, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for being here. And Katie, both of you are amazing. Thank you. I'm also in Claire's book group. And my question is, in Boston, like, what organization? I don't want to rebuild the wheel, because I just want to connect to an organization that you feel is really looking at the problems, not about the police, that is working. And I know that, Katie, you mentioned the Muslim
Justice League. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's, I'll check that out too, but I would love to be part of something that I can be a part, that I can do, that is really of worth.
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer for Boston. In Cambridge, they have Cambridge Heart, which has really tried to have a community-centered approach to reimagining public safety. In Boston, it seems to be driven a little bit more by the mayor's office, working in conjunction with some other groups. Let me just, here, I have my notes from that meeting. Let me see if it listed some, no, we just talked about, they do have community partners in doing like the outreach and the focus groups and stuff, but I don't have like a list of the names. So you could contact the mayor's office and ask them if, ask to speak to someone working on public safety in the mayor's office, and who are these community partners and how many of them have a kind of grassroots aspect to their work.
Great. Thank you so much.
I just want to offer a couple of additional suggestions of groups that are working on these issues in the space in Boston. There's an organization that's called the Asian American Resource Workshop. They do a lot of work around issues of kind of immigration enforcement and policing overlaps. They're based in Dorchester. The Louis D. Brown Peace Institute does incredible work with survivors of homicide to try to provide a really holistic centering focus on getting people access to counseling and resources. So it depends on kind of how broadly construed in this conversation you want to look. But if you want to email me, I can certainly give you a rundown of places that I know that would be happy to accept volunteers and other people to get engaged in political work in that space. And I'll drop my email in the chat. It's also available to anyone on the internet. So we're going to keep moving through questions. We had another one that was sent directly to me by somebody who's not in a position to ask it themselves at the moment. This question came from Josh Harson, and Josh's question was, to the point of removing power from the criminal legal system and giving it to the communities to respond to violence. I absolutely agree, and I have a question and concern. What about instances of domestic violence, particularly as it relates to patriarchal power structures and where women and femmes are treated, if not as property, then at least as less fully human than men? Is there a role in your mind for formal institutions to handle or respond to violence, albeit ones that are wholly separate from the current criminal legal system?
Yeah, so the DV thing is obviously incredibly complicated and fraught and terribly important, and makes up a significant amount of interpersonal violence in our society. So it's not that disconnected, though, from community violence. The individuals involved are often the same. The presence of weapons, it's interrelated. There's feelings of insecurity, unaddressed past trauma, and this creates a kind of toxic mix. So I absolutely agree that we're not going to be able to do anything about domestic violence if we don't start addressing these questions of a kind of toxic masculinity. What is it? What's driving it? And what are the mechanisms we can use to try to unwind it? What I'm hearing is that, addressing past trauma, which is a very real factor, right? Most domestic violence offenders were themselves subjected to childhood abuse and other kinds of intimate violence in their own lives, right? This is a cycle that gets passed on. And so we've got to break that cycle. And part of that involves addressing that past trauma. And so we need mechanisms to try to bring people into that kind of healing environment as a way of breaking the cycle. And what we hear from the folks who are subjected to this violence is generally, they don't want their partners criminalized. They want help in fixing their families. And if not that, then they want credible pathways to independence, which means access to income support, secure housing, childcare, and things like that.
I just offer also a couple
There's
others.
a wonderful book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, which shows just how profoundly the criminal legal system has failed to protect women.
Yeah, and I would offer just two other suggestions of other resources that I did send to Josh directly already. One is Lee Goodmark's work, who
He wrote
I think,
Decriminalizing Domestic Violence.
right, absolutely, yeah. And so she's written a number of law review articles also on the topic. And then I wanted to name the organization, which now is escaping me, the name of the organization, Survived and Punished, which does a lot of work with criminalized survivors of violence. And I'm going to tee up that in a few weeks, on October 18th, we're having a talk with Jocelyn Simonson and Tracy McCarter and Rachel Foran to talk about one particular case of criminalized surviving of violence. Tracy will be here to talk about her own experience navigating that case and building a defense campaign. And I think that puts a finer point on those questions of who systems are serving, right, and whether people are being protected or harmed in the process of the existing structures.
And
Jocelyn's
book about these movements is tremendous. So I'm glad you're having her on.
Yes, I'm very excited as well. I know, so I hope people will come on back. And so our next question is from Donovan Tavares. Donovan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Peace. So I'm a community organizer in New York, in the south side of Brooklyn. And so I'm sure you know our mayor, Eric Adams, who's a former cop. And he poses a lot of narratives that kind of, pit one under-resourced, oppressed group against another under-resourced oppressed group. For example, now we have this, quote unquote, supposed migrant crisis And when with that happening, freezing, SNAP benefits or food stamps going to New Yorkers, and then saying that we have to do that because of these migrants that are coming to New York, which are really asylum seekers that have there's laws in place that we should be equipped to take care of them. And my question is more so just how do we get ahead of these narratives, because with a lot of community members focusing on the news and other resources to keep up to date with what's going on in the city, we're experiencing that a lot of people are kind of hinging on these narratives and saying that policing or austerity budgets and all these kinds of things are a tax that we pay to make sure that we're safe, right?
Yeah.
You can frisk 1,000 Black men, find one gun. That's a tax that we pay in order to feel safe in the city. And that's one question. My other question, I know that we only have about 3 minutes left in this meeting. I don't want to get too far into it, but just if you can say a little bit on the fact that if police exist in order to manage the conditions of poverty and exploitation, what needs to be happening in the parallel in the fight for abolition in terms of policing, in terms of the critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
And,
All right.
and
So,
what's happening.
Eric, who I've known for many years, is not only a former police officer, he's a former Republican. And if you look at, who funded his campaign and who he hangs out in fancy restaurants with, right? It's the architects of austerity. It's the high level real estate interests, bankers, etc. So he has no plan to address inequality. He has no plan to move away from austerity politics. And therefore, he needs police to manage the consequences of that system. And that involves the demonization of those on the losing end of those arrangements. So he demonizes homeless folks, he demonizes folks with mental health challenges, he demonizes migrants, because the ideology of a police-centered approach is that those are bad people who will only respond to punitive interventions. So the narrative response to that has to be rooted in solidarity, care, and compassion. Greg Abbott made a masterful move in sending migrants to these northern democratic cities. And Eric Adams played into his hand 100%. Abbott should be patting him on the back. I think he's here in New York today because he is proving Abbott right in every measure. The only appropriate response to what Abbott is doing is to say, send more. That New York City has always been a gateway to migration, that we are part of a global community, that yes, this is going to involve sacrifice. It's going to be difficult, but this is not new for New York City. Everyone's like, it's an unprecedented crisis. That's nonsense. The period 100 years ago looked, or 110 years ago, 120 years ago, looked exactly the same in many regards. Police stations were used as homeless shelters throughout the city 120 years ago. This is not new. We brought those people in, we integrated them into society. Was it difficult? Yes. Were there problems? Yes. Is that what we should do now? Yes. And take the political wind out of his sails. And also just establish the humanity of these folks instead of demonizing them. He's playing right into the hands of the most reactionary proto-fascist forces in the city by doing this, and he knows he's doing that, and he's basically happy about it. It's a political calculation, and it's extremely dangerous.
We have maybe time for one more question, Alex. I know you've got to run. So if this is the need for us to end, then this may be the time to end. What do you think?
Do we have a short one that's just a quick question?
I think the last one I saw, we've got one about prosecutors, which we'll reserve. I hope you'll come back for another time. But we had one that was about your own relationship as a researcher to the communities you work with, from Jessica Katzenstein.
Okay, so I do not get a lot of invitations from American policing oriented institutions anymore. I used to. I do still get them quite a bit internationally. I'm headed down to Colombia on Monday, and I'll be meeting with the Ministry of Justice officials there, law school professors, human rights lawyers, and I've worked with other ministries of justice and police departments around the world. Mostly, I'm not really that focused on police departments. And I changed the bio on my webpage and kind of took that out because in a way I'm trying to go over their head. So that's why I'm more interested in talking to a city council or a mayor or a ministry of justice about rethinking public safety, not trying to fix policing.
Thank you for that. I know we've got to be respectful of everybody's time, so we so appreciate you being here, Alex. And I know people can continue to follow your work through your Substack, which I just reposted that link in the chat. And thank you. And please keep coming back, everyone. Our next talk is on October 11th, also in this same window. And we will continue to share these resources. They'll be posted on our website along with the video of this talk in a few weeks. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it.